In this video, I'm going to explain the differences between plastic models and metal ones. So I get people that ask me all the time, well, what's the difference between plastic models and metal models? Which one's better? Which one, if a company makes models that are out of both, which one should I pick? How's that work? And it's really kind of a personal preference, as are most things in life. There are some pretty fundamental differences between the two types of models. As far as detail is concerned, at this point in time, there's pretty much no difference. It used to be back in the day that when plastic models first came out, the molding process was pretty janky, and so plastic models had a pretty soft detail, and just didn't have real nice sharp detail. So people preferred metal models and didn't really like the plastic ones. But now at this point, the technology's gotten to the point where really, there's no big difference between the two in detail. However, if you like to convert models, and by convert models I mean take a model the way it's supposed to be built and modify it to make it be built a different way, changing leg positions a lot, swapping out weapons, getting rid of the head and putting a different one on, that kind of stuff. Plastic's a lot easier, and the reason is because it's just so much easier to take a clippers to a plastic model and just cut off the parts you don't want than it is with a metal model. Metal models are difficult sometimes to convert because there's a lot of filing and sanding and all kinds of stuff, and getting bigger, thicker chunks off of the model it's just very difficult. You end up having to use maybe a jeweler's saw or something like that. And with plastic, the clippers that I use to clip my models off of the sprue, that's normally the main tool I use if I'm converting a plastic model. Gluing the models is very different between plastic and metal. With plastic, many of the glues that we use in the plastic are actually designed to just slightly melt the plastic where they touch, specifically with plastic cement. But even with CA glue, there's just a little bit of that going on. So they're really more actually kind of melting the plastic and kind of sticking it together. Whereas with metal, it's very non-porous. The glue itself is having almost no effect on the actual metal itself. So you have to really scrape up the two surfaces, like with your hobby knife, so that they've got a little bit of kind of purchase when they glue together. And more often than not, if it's a bigger, heavier model, if it's an arm on a war jack for War Machine or Hordes or something like that, you're probably going to have to pin it. Pinning is when you drill a hole on one side where the two parts are going to go together, and then you have to try to drill another hole exactly in the same spot on the other side, and then actually put a piece of wire or clip a piece of thicker, like paper clip, something like that, and put it in there as an added kind of connector between the two pieces. Because again, of the weight of a metal model, that arm that's being held up with the big club it's putting a lot of stress on this joint where it's being glued to the torso. And because of that, you can easily knock limbs off, and it happens quite frequently. So you need to pin, specifically with bigger, heavier models. You just have to pin. And probably you want to use epoxy as opposed to your normal CA glue, or you obviously don't use plastic cement. Now, of course, there's the weight as well. Some people prefer the heavier model. They just like the feel of it when they're moving it around on the table. Some people have no real interest in having a heavy model, and they are fine with having a lighter model. The differences also in that situation are that a heavier model is a little bit more likely to chip because of the inertia. Like if you knock it over, a very, very light plastic model doesn't have a lot of inertia behind it when it hits the surface that it hits, and possibly chips off some paint. But a metal model, yeah, you're going to have some inertia, and you're going to probably get a little bit of a paint chipping problem going on, especially if you drop it on the floor. A plastic model dropped onto a non-carpeted floor, you might pop off an arm if you catch it just right, but you're probably not going to chip too much paint. But a metal model, yeah, I've done that before. A lot of paint can come off in one single drop. One of the great benefits of metal models is they're much easier to strip paint off of. If you buy some used models, some pro-painted models on eBay, and you want to strip all that pro paint off of that model, it's much easier to do with metal models because you can really throw some, for lack of a better word, nasty chemicals onto those models, and you're not going to melt the metal. You're not going to melt the material that makes up the model. You have to be much more careful when you are finding a fluid to strip plastic models with. And God forbid that you use resin models. Resin is kind of a form of plastic, but it's not quite the same stuff. But it is even more delicate as far as stripping is concerned. So with metal models, you can throw liquid, a fingernail polish remover directly in there, which is basically acetone, and you can take that stuff off. If you do that to plastic, you're going to have a pile of mush when you're done. So that's a real benefit for metal models. One of the last things I'm going to talk about is cost. Generally, there's not a huge difference in cost. The new line of Reaper Bones miniatures that Reaper puts out, they're very cheap because they're plastic, but it's because they're a very cheap bendy plastic. There's lots of different gauges of plastic out there, toughnesses and flexibilities and such. So the majority of the models that you're going to buy that are made out of injection molded plastic these days are a harder plastic, so they don't bend very easily. But there's also a benefit. Sometimes it's like a bummer if they don't bend, but on the other hand, the sword that they're holding is probably going to stay pretty straight. Whereas most Reaper Bones, if you look at them in the package, they're already kind of pre-bent. So you have to be a little careful with that sometimes. But the very inexpensive bendy plastics like that are a good deal cheaper than metal or even regular hard plastic. Regular hard plastic and metal are generally about the same cost. It's just that bigger companies can make hard plastic models a little bit cheaper. And the reason is because the mold for a hard plastic model is very expensive to produce. Anywhere from $5,000 to $50,000 American to make a good injection mold. They're made out of steel, okay? So the trick is that it's very expensive up front, but then putting the plastic and injecting the plastic in there is relatively inexpensive. And because that model is so strong, or that mold is so strong, you're going to be able to crank those models out for years and years and years and years to come without having to make a new mold. On the other hand, metal uses almost like a rubbery kind of material for the mold, which doesn't last nearly as long. It's very cheap to produce. If you're making low numbers, if you're an indie game company or something like that, most of them are going to be making their stuff out of metal because they can crank out lower numbers more effectively, more cheaply. And if they have to make a new mold, it's not that big of a deal. Big companies like Games Workshop and a lot of the other companies that are moving in that direction, like Weird Games, they've pretty much all moved to hard plastic. You're starting to see it now also with War Machine and Hordes. They're starting to move to hard plastics. So they're doing this because they've got the money to put it up front, but then the per unit cost is much, much cheaper. Once you kind of spread it all out, it sort of comes to the same. But for a small company, let's say, somebody who's an independent, they're working predominantly in metals because they're not making more than maybe a couple hundred or maybe 1,000 of a specific model as opposed to thousands and thousands of a big company. So for us as the person buying the models, there's not a huge difference in cost, but it depends on the size of the company and kind of like that. But then when you go to Reaper Bones or God forbid something like Hero Clicks or things like that, which are very bendy, that plastic is a good deal cheaper. So really, the differences between metal and plastic, they all kind of come down to preference, to individual preference. I myself prefer plastics because I find them easier to build and easier to convert and do things like that. But yet, I've got metal models on my paint desk right now. So, it depends on the size of the company. It depends on how many models they're making. But as far as the final product, detail versus detail, they're basically identical. So let me know what you think, what your preference is down in the comments below. If you've got any tips for working with maybe metal models to make them a little bit easier to glue together, let us know. If you've got some things about, but maybe you didn't say this about plastics because plastics can really be this kind of problem, let us know. I always like to kind of keep an open channel and hear from the audience, and I hope that you guys read the comments and then also learn as well. But yeah, either way, you're going to get a good final product. It just sort of depends on the path you take to get there.